The persistent drumming of rain against the forensic pathology lab windows was the only sound that cut through the low hum of the ventilation system. It was a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound, a constant companion to my late nights. I leaned closer to the microscope, my breath fogging the eyepiece for a brief moment before I pulled back, refocusing. The world outside, a blur of city lights and sodden concrete, held no interest for me tonight. My entire universe was currently contained within this small, illuminated circle. On the slide, a single, almost ethereal fiber lay stretched across the field of view. It was synthetic, certainly, with a subtle iridescence that hinted at a complex molecular structure. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance of tweezers and slides, adjusted the fine focus knob with an almost unconscious precision. This wasn't just any fiber. This was the anomaly. The victim, a man named Marcus Thorne, had been found in an abandoned warehouse down by the docks. Blunt force trauma to the head, swift and brutal. But the scene itself, it had been a masterclass in absence. No fingerprints, not a single stray hair, no footprints beyond what the first responders had inevitably left. Even the blood spatter was minimal, contained to an impossible degree, as if the killing had occurred inside a meticulously sealed box, then the body carefully placed. The lead detective, a gruff woman with a permanent scowl and a surprising fondness for artisanal coffee, had called it the cleanest damn murder scene I've ever had the misfortune to process. She'd meant it as a compliment to the perpetrator, I think, but it had grated on me. Clean doesn't exist in a violent death. There's always something, and there was. Buried deep in the sole of Thorne's worn work boot, almost fused into the rubber, I'd found it, this fiber. It was microscopic, requiring a specialized light source and a magnification level that most of the field agents wouldn't even bother with. My colleagues, bless their pragmatic hearts, had initially dismissed it as environmental contamination. Another stray thread, Chen, the senior analyst had mumbled, eyes already drifting to the next case file, probably from the victim's own clothes or a passing truck driver. But I knew better. My fingers had a memory for textures, my eyes for patterns. I'd spent 2 decades sifting through the detritus of tragedy, finding stories in dust motes and skin cells. This fiber didn't match anything in Thorne's known wardrobe. It wasn't from any common industrial fabric I recognized. And more significantly, its surface structure under high magnification showed a unique, almost hydrophobic quality. It seemed designed to repel other particulate matter, making it incredibly difficult for it to have been picked up incidentally and held so securely. That's what gnawed at me. If this fiber was so resistant to attachment, how had it become so deeply embedded? It suggested a prolonged exposure or perhaps a deliberate act. It defied the cleanliness of the scene. It was a single, defiant note in an otherwise perfectly orchestrated silence. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. Was I overthinking it? Was I chasing a ghost? The doubt, a familiar, unwelcome guest, flickered. It was easy to get lost in the minutiae to see meaning where there was only chaos. But then I looked at the fiber again, its subtle shimmer under the lab light, and a stubborn certainty solidified within me. This wasn't chaos. This was deliberate. This was a message. The door to my lab hissed open, letting in a gust of cooler air and the scent of stale coffee. The lead detective stood framed in the doorway, her raincoat still glistening from the downpour. He carried a steaming mug. "Anything, Chen?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "We're hitting brick walls on motive. Thorne was clean, no enemies, no debts, just a quiet man who worked hard." I gestured to the microscope. "Come see this, detective." She approached, a frown creasing her brow. "Another fiber, Chen. We've cataloged every thread within a 10-meter radius of that body. It's nothing." "It's not nothing," I said, my voice low but firm. "It's peculiar, look." She peered into the eyepiece, her face close to the cold metal. After a moment, she pulled back, blinking. "Okay, it's pretty, but what is it?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," I admitted. "It's synthetic, highly specialized, and it was lodged in the victim's boot sole deep. The scene was wiped clean, right? Every surface, every potential print. But this fiber should have been one of the easiest things to remove, or, conversely, it should have been virtually impossible for it to adhere in the first place, given its properties." The detective squinted, her gaze shifting from the microscope to my face. "So you're saying someone cleaned the scene, missed a tiny, shiny thread that actively repels other particles. Or, I offered, they didn't miss it, or it was placed there after the cleaning. Or the victim was in a very specific environment before he arrived at the warehouse, an environment so unusual that it left this behind. That environment was the true killing ground. My mind raced, connecting dots that didn't yet form a picture, only a scattered constellation. It feels like a deliberate oversight or a deliberate inclusion. She took a long sip of her coffee, her eyes narrowed. A deliberate oversight? You think our killer is playing games, Chen? I think our killer is very, very good, I corrected, a cold certainty settling in my gut. Too good. The absence of evidence at that warehouse isn't a lack of information, detective. It is information. It tells me someone went to extraordinary lengths to control the narrative of that scene. And this fiber, this tiny, impossible fiber, it's the only word they left behind that wasn't part of their script. The rain outside intensified, lashing against the glass, mimicking the sudden acceleration of my thoughts. This wasn't just a murder. This was a performance. And I had a feeling this tiny, iridescent thread was the only clue to the stage directions. The tension in the room thickened, palpable, as the detective and I both stared at the microscope, at the single, defiant anomaly that had shattered the illusion of a clean crime. This wasn't going to be easy. This was going to be a battle of wits, and I was just starting to realize how deep the rabbit hole might go. The rain outside intensified, lashing against the glass, mimicking the sudden acceleration of my thoughts. The tension in the room thickened, palpable, as the lead detective, a man whose patience wore thin with every passing minute on a scene, sighed heavily beside me. Anything, Chen? Or are we just admiring the killer's artistic flair? His voice was a low growl, barely audible over the drumming rain. I ignored him, my gaze fixed on the minuscule strand I'd carefully transferred to a sterile slide. Give me an hour. I'm taking this back. Back in the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, the silence was a welcome change from the cacophony of the crime scene. My gloved hands, steady and precise, manipulated the microscope's fine adjustment knob. The iridescent thread, no thicker than a spider's silk, shimmered under the focused light. It wasn't textile fiber, not cotton, not wool, not even silk in the traditional sense. It possessed a synthetic sheen, a peculiar elasticity, and a composition that seemed to defy common industrial materials. Under higher magnification, I could make out microscopic grooves, almost like miniature channels running along its length. It was engineered, designed for a specific purpose, but what and why here? I spent the next few hours running preliminary tests, cross-referencing databases. Nothing. No match in any known fiber archive, no common polymers, nothing that screamed off the shelf. It was bespoke, perhaps, or something I simply hadn't encountered before. The absence of information was in itself a clue. It spoke of meticulous planning, a killer who didn't leave behind readily identifiable mistakes. My colleague, a junior analyst still navigating the labyrinthine protocols of the lab, peered over my shoulder. Still on the magician case, Chen. The detective thinks it's an inside job, some rival business partner. I hummed, not looking up. The detective thinks a lot of things. What's the latest on the victim's talk screen? Clean, not a drop of anything unusual, just a good old-fashioned blunt force trauma to the back of the head, quick and efficient. The colleague shrugged, already losing interest. No struggle, no defensive wounds, just lights out. Exactly, I murmured, a flicker of something unsettling in my gut. Too clean. A performance, yes, but a performance where the main actor seemed to have walked willingly onto the stage, or been rendered utterly helpless before the curtain rose. The iridescent thread felt like a loose costume button, a single misplaced detail in an otherwise flawless act. I filed the preliminary report, noting the unusual fiber and its unknown origin, knowing it would raise eyebrows and invite skepticism from those who preferred their evidence neatly packaged. The next morning, before the city had fully shaken off the night's damp chill, my phone buzzed with an urgency that always meant bad news. Another call. Another scene. This time the detective's voice was tight, strained. You need to see this, Chen, immediately. The location was an abandoned factory on the city's outskirts, a hulking skeleton of rusting corrugated iron and broken windows. The air was thick with the metallic tang of decay and a faint, acrid smell I couldn't immediately place. The rain had paused, leaving the ground slick and reflecting the gray dawn sky in muddy puddles. As I stepped inside, the scale of the place swallowed me. It was vast, cavernous, with a ceiling that soared 3 stories high, crisscrossed with defunct gantries and skeletal beams. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through the grimy panes, illuminating a scene that instantly made my breath catch. There, suspended almost 30 feet above the concrete floor, was the victim. It was a woman, dressed in simple, dark clothing, her limbs hanging limp, her head lolling to one side. She looked almost like a marionette strung up by invisible wires. But there were no wires, no ropes, no chains, no visible means of support whatsoever. She simply hung there, defying gravity, perfectly centered in the immense space. Below her, the floor was pristine, covered in a thick layer of undisturbed industrial dust. No footprints, no drag marks, no discarded equipment. My initial thought was a trick of the light, an elaborate illusion. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the image remained. The victim was real, tragically so, and he was undeniably suspended in midair. The detective, his face pale, shook his head slowly. "We've been here for an hour. Nobody touched anything. We can't figure it out. No ladders, no lifts, no scaffolding. The dust hasn't been disturbed. It's impossible." I walked slowly around the perimeter of the stage, my gaze sweeping the floor, the walls, the ceiling. My eyes narrowed, searching for the telltale signs of manipulation, scuff marks, smudges, a disturbed cobweb, a faint impression in the dust. It was as if he had simply materialized there. The only thing out of place was the victim herself. "No, it's not impossible," I corrected, my voice firmer now, pushing past the initial shock. "It's just..." The first scene, the meticulous staging, the absence of struggle, it all clicked into place. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a deliberate statement, an escalation. This killer wasn't just hiding their tracks. They were flaunting their mastery, challenging us to even comprehend their methods. I looked up at the suspended figure again, a new detail catching my eye, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer near her left sleeve. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from a sudden surge of something akin to furious determination. I knew what I was looking for, and I had a terrible feeling I was going to find it. This was an invitation, and I had a feeling this impossible scene was just the beginning of the killer's macabre performance. My mind raced, trying to grasp the implications. How could someone achieve this? And if they could do this, what else were they capable of? The silence in the room was almost a physical weight pressing in on me. No, not silence. The hum of the ventilation system, the distant murmur of the team outside the taped perimeter, the faint drip of condensation from a pipe. Overhead, these were the sounds that filled the space, amplifying the absence of anything truly meaningful. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the stage, my gaze sweeping the floor, the walls, the ceiling. The previous victim had been found in a similar, impossibly clean setting. This one, a young woman, lay composed on a faded Persian rug, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, a single white lily clutched in her hands. No blood, no obvious wounds. My colleague, a seasoned evidence technician, moved with practiced efficiency, dusting for prints on the antique wooden dresser. "Nothing so far, Chen," he called out, his voice low. "Just the usual dust and a couple of partials that look like they belong to the victim." I knelt, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves, leaned closer to the victim. Her skin was cool, almost waxy. I noted the faint, almost imperceptible sheen on her lips, then carefully, using a sterile swab, collected a sample. It wasn't organic. It looked like a fragment of polished stone, perhaps obsidian, but it was so tiny I could barely make it out. I carefully transferred it to a sterile vial. This was the kind of detail that could be a clue or just environmental debris. With this killer, every speck felt like a deliberate taunt. "Let's get the laser on the floor," I instructed another technician. "I want to see if anything was dragged, however lightly." The red beam swept across the worn floorboards, illuminating every stray fiber and dust bunny, revealing no discernible drag marks, no impressions of heavy objects, no disturbed dust lines. It was pristine, too pristine. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just a murder, it was a theatrical production, meticulously choreographed, and the director was a ghost. After hours of painstaking work, meticulously bagging and tagging every potential piece of evidence, we finally cleared the scene. The drive back to the facility was quiet, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked windows of the transport van. My mind replayed every detail, every angle. The lily, the composed expression, the utter lack of struggle. It felt like a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and the other half deliberately mislabeled. Back at the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, I felt a familiar sense of determination settle over me. The sterile environment, the rows of microscopes, the hum of the analytical instruments, this was where the real hunt began. I bypassed my office, heading straight for the main lab, dropping the evidence bags onto my workbench. The air was thick with the metallic tang of reagents and the faint, sweet scent of formaldehyde. I started with the trace evidence, the fibers from the victim's clothing, the dust samples from the rug, the swab from her lips, and that tiny speck from her earlobe. Under the powerful magnification of the stereo microscope, the world transformed. Fibers, once indistinguishable to the naked eye, became intricate landscapes of twisted threads and embedded particles. The first cuts, the initial analyses, were baffling. The fibers collected from the victim's clothes, a blend of cotton and synthetic, matched her wardrobe perfectly. But the few stray fibers found on the rug beneath her, a common polyester blend, didn't match anything in the room, nor did they match her clothing. A red herring or simply contamination from someone who had been in the room previously? I made a note, pushing down a flicker of frustration. Then came the smudged prints. A partial palm print on the dresser, too incomplete for identification. A few faint fingerprints on the lily stem, consistent with the victim's own. Nothing from an unknown individual. It was as if the killer had worn gloves or simply wiped every surface clean with an obsessive fervor. But then how did the victim get the lily? Had she been given it before her death, or was it placed there by the killer who then meticulously wiped their own prints? Anything, Chen? The detective's voice broke my concentration. We've got nothing. No forced entry. No witnesses, no apparent motive. Just another perfectly staged scene. I sighed, adjusting the microscope's focus. It's too clean, detective. That's the problem. Too perfect. We've got some generic polyester fibers that don't belong, but they're so common they could be from anywhere. The victim's lips show traces of a mild sedative, but nothing definitive. Nothing that would knock her out instantly without a struggle. The forensic pathologist confirms cause of death was asphyxiation, but without any bruising or external marks. It's like she just stopped breathing. The detective frowned, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. Asphyxiation without a struggle, so he was already incapacitated. It seems that way, but the sedative isn't strong enough to completely immobilize someone, and there's no struggle in the room, no defensive wounds on the victim. I paused, looking up from the eyepiece. The only thing that stands out, it's barely anything, is this. I pointed to the vial containing the tiny speck from the victim's earlobe. It's a fragment of what looks like polished black stone, obsidian maybe, but it's so small I can't be sure without further analysis. Obsidian, he repeated, a hint of skepticism in his voice. Like volcanic rock, what would that even mean? I don't know yet. It's an anomaly in an otherwise sterile environment. I felt a familiar prickle of doubt. There was I grasping at straws, focusing on an insignificant detail because the larger picture was so stubbornly blank. This killer was good, too good. They were leaving behind just enough to confuse, just enough to make us question our own methods. So, you're telling me, the detective said, his voice laced with growing frustration, that after all that meticulous work, all those hours, we have a common fiber, a weak sedative, a tiny piece of rock that might be obsidian, nothing that tells us who or why. I pushed away from the microscope, rubbing my temples. I'm telling you we have a killer who understands forensic science, detective, someone who knows how to manipulate a scene, how to leave just enough ambiguity to send us down blind alleys. This isn't just a murder, it's a deliberate misdirection. He ran a hand over his face. Misdirection or not, Chen, we're no closer to an arrest. It's like they're laughing at us. I looked down at the tiny vial, the speck of black stone reflecting the harsh lab lights. Was it a signature, a deliberate plant, or just random debris? My mind raced, trying to connect the dots that weren't there. This wasn't adding up. The pristine scene, the lack of struggle, the subtle sedative, the common fibers, and then this unusual, almost out-of-place fragment. It felt like a carefully constructed illusion, and I was staring at the seams, trying to figure out where the trick began. The rain hammered against the windows of the forensic pathology lab, each drop a tiny percussion against the glass, mirroring the frantic beat in my own chest. It was late, the hum of the ventilation system a low thrum against the backdrop of the storm. The black speck of stone from the vial sat on my workstation, glinting under the harsh overhead lights. A silent accusation. A signature? A taunt? My mind kept circling back to it, a persistent fly in my mental ointment. I pushed away from the microscope for a moment, rubbing the bridge of my nose. The victim's personal effects were spread out on a clean sheet of butcher paper beside me, a worn wallet, a set of keys, a cheap plastic watch. All meticulously catalogued, photographed, and bagged. Standard procedure. Nothing screamed out of place at first glance. That was the problem. Everything was too standard, too clean for a violent death. My colleague, the digital forensics specialist, was hunched over a bank of monitors across the room, the faint blue glow illuminating his focused face. He was still sifting through the victim's phone and laptop, looking for anything, any digital breadcrumb that could lead us somewhere. So far, nothing. The victim's online presence was unremarkable, their communication logs mundane. No secret accounts, no suspicious contacts, no frantic last messages, just the digital equivalent of a blank wall. Anything interesting on the victim's social circles? I called out, my voice sounding rough in the quiet lab. He didn't look up, fingers flying across the keyboard. Clean, almost suspiciously clean. No recent arguments, no spats, no online dramas. Their last few weeks are a digital desert of normalcy. A desert of normalcy, I muttered, turning back to my own evidence. That phrase resonated. It was precisely what bothered me about the physical scene, too. No forced entry, no struggle, no defensive wounds. The sedative had worked perfectly. Someone knew what they were doing. I picked up the victim's jacket, a nondescript dark gray tweed, and laid it under the stereo microscope. I'd already done a preliminary sweep, but I needed to go deeper. Every fiber, every dust particle could tell a story. I adjusted the focus, the weave of the fabric expanding into a landscape of threads. There were the usual environmental particles. Dog hair the victim owned a terrier according to the detective lint street dust. All accounted for. My eyes scanned, moving slowly, methodically. Left sleeve, right sleeve, collar, lapels. Nothing. This was what department skeptics love to point to. Chen, you're chasing ghosts. It's just a clean scene. Some professional hit, probably. But my gut churned. A clean scene was rarely truly clean. There was always something. And then I saw it. On the inside seam of the left cuff, almost invisible against the dark fabric. A single, short fiber. It was a synthetic, a fine, almost translucent strand, barely a millimeter long. My breath hitched. This wasn't tweed. This wasn't dog hair. This wasn't even a common clothing fiber. It was too fine, too uniform. I carefully extracted it with a pair of fine-tipped tweezers and transferred it to a slide. Under the higher magnification of the compound microscope, its true nature became clearer. It was an optical fiber. A hair-thin strand of glass, or perhaps a polymer, designed to transmit light. Not the kind of fiber I'd find clinging to someone's everyday jacket, not unless they worked with it or were in close proximity to it. My mind started working through scenarios. Was it from some piece of tech the victim owned? Unlikely to be shed so easily. Was it from the killer? More probable. But why only one so perfectly placed on an inside seam as if it had been deliberately tucked there? It was almost too neat, too much of a clue. I felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't random debris. This was planted, and if it was planted, it was either a mistake on the killer's part or a deliberate misdirection. A whisper in the lab meant to be heard, but leading us down the wrong path. I turned my attention to the digital forensics specialist again. Hey, did the victim have any smart home devices? Any fiber optic internet connections at their residence or workplace? He swiveled in his chair, a frown creasing his brow. Their home internet was standard copper wire. Workplace was an old-school Ethernet setup. No fancy fiber optic network. No smart home tech beyond a basic speaker for music. Why? I held up the slide, the tiny fiber glowing faintly under the microscope light. I found this, an optical fiber, on the victim's jacket. It's not consistent with their environment or belongings. He peered at it, his expression shifting from curiosity to a sharp, analytical focus. An optical fiber, huh? That's specific, not something you just brush off a bus seat. Exactly, I said, my voice low, and it was on an inside seam, almost hidden. This wasn't just a cunning killer. This was someone who understood the meticulous world of trace evidence. Someone who knew where we would look and how we would analyze. The black stone, the perfect sedative, the lack of struggle, the clean digital footprint, and now this. This planted fiber. It wasn't a mistake. It was a breadcrumb laid out with surgical precision. But where did it lead? To a false trail, I suspected. The killer wasn't just hiding their tracks. They were actively laying down false ones, daring us to follow. I looked down at the fiber again, then at the black stone, then out at the rain streaking the windows. The world outside felt a million miles away. This killer wasn't afraid of us. They were toying with us. They weren't just murderers. They were forensic artists, crafting a narrative of misdirection, turning my own science against me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was personal, not just for the victims, but for me. This was a challenge, and I had a feeling this was only the beginning of their elaborate game. The rain lashed against the windows of the forensic pathology lab, each gust rattling the panes like an impatient spirit. Inside, the sterile hum of the ventilation system was the only constant companion, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in my mind. I traced the condensation patterns on the glass with a gloved finger, the cold seeping through the latex. The last scene, the perfect sedative, the black stone, it all spun in a dizzying loop. This wasn't just a killer, this was a strategist, a meticulous architect of death, and they were mocking us with every precisely placed detail. My desk was a battlefield of files. Autopsy reports, toxicology screens, victim profiles, digital forensics summaries, each stacked like fortifications around my laptop. I'd been here for hours, the scent of antiseptic and stale coffee clinging to my clothes. The detective had called an hour ago, his voice tight with frustration. Anything, Chen, anything at all that makes sense? I had nothing concrete, just a gut feeling that hardened into a conviction with every passing minute. The previous victims, there were 3 now. The first, a retired archivist found in his meticulously organized apartment. The second, a quiet software engineer, discovered in an abandoned warehouse. And the latest, a project manager for a construction firm left on a deserted dock. No forced entry, no struggle, no clear motive. Just the black stone carefully placed and the chilling absence of any useful trace. "Focus, Chen," I muttered to myself, pushing away the half-eaten protein bar. The killer understood trace evidence. They knew how to clean a scene, how to manipulate a narrative. So if the scenes were clean, maybe the answers weren't at the scenes at all. Maybe the answers lay in the victims themselves, beyond the immediate circumstances of their deaths. I pulled up the digital files for each victim. Standard background checks yielded nothing connecting them. Different ages, different professions, different social circles. No shared employers, no common addresses, no mutual acquaintances that the initial sweep had uncovered. It was like they were randomly plucked from the city's vast population. But a killer this precise didn't pick randomly, not with the effort they were putting into the staging. I started digging deeper past the surface-level reports. I looked at their personal effects again, not just for fingerprints or fibers, but for meaning. The archivist had a collection of antique maps. The engineer, a shelf full of obscure coding manuals. The project manager, a meticulously organized toolkit. All things that spoke of precision, of order. My gaze drifted to the rain-streaked window again. Order, that was the key. I opened a separate browser window and began cross-referencing every minor detail I could find from their lives. Old tax records, social media accounts, what little they had, obscure forum posts, even their library borrowing histories. It was a tedious, mind-numbing process, but my determination burned hot. There had to be something. Hours blurred. My eyes ached, but a flicker of something. A tiny spark caught my attention. It was so faint, so insignificant that I almost dismissed it. Tucked away in the archivist's digital footprint, buried in a folder labeled Old Certifications, was a scan document. It wasn't a degree or a standard professional license. It was a certificate from something called the Institute of Applied Metrology and Precision Standards, dated almost 20 years ago, a program for advanced calibration and quality assurance protocols. My eyebrows furrowed. Metrology, the science of measurement, precision standards, that resonated with the killer's MO. But what was an archivist doing with that? I made a note, then moved on. Next, the software engineer. His digital life was sparse, but I found a mention in an old, defunct online forum dedicated to high-accuracy sensor deployment. In his profile, under qualifications, he'd listed the same institute. IAMP Standards Certified. It read, the same place, the same niche field. My pulse quickened. I pulled up the project manager's files, my fingers flying across the keyboard. This one was harder. His professional life seemed entirely focused on construction management, no obvious links to metrology. I scrolled through old resumes, past employers, and then a breakthrough. 10 years prior to his current role, he'd worked for a short stint at a firm specializing in industrial environmental monitoring systems. And listed under his skills section, buried deep, was IAMP Advanced Calibration. My chair scraped back as I pushed away from the desk. 3 victims, 3 seemingly disparate individuals, all with a connection to the Institute of Applied Metrology and Precision Standards. Not a degree, not a major career path, but a specialized certification, a testament to a very specific, very precise skill set. It was the kind of detail that would be overlooked by anyone not actively seeking a pattern of meticulousness. I pulled up the Institute's website. It was still active, but small, almost an anachronism. It offered highly specialized, intensive courses, not mass education. This wasn't a casual hobby. This was serious, rigorous training. This was someone who understood the meticulous world of trace evidence because they themselves might operate within a world of extreme precision. The black stone, the perfect sedative, the lack of struggle, the clean digital footprint. It all pointed to a killer who valued exactitude. And now the victims shared a link to the very concept of precision. But why? Why these 3? What did an archivist, an engineer, and a project manager have in common beyond a niche certificate from 2 decades ago? Was it a shared project? A past betrayal? The connection was undeniably there, a thin, almost invisible thread woven through their disparate lives. But the tapestry it formed, the motive, remained frustratingly out of reach. The rain continued its relentless assault outside, mirroring the storm of questions raging within me. The forensic pathology lab hummed with a low, constant drone, a symphony of ventilation systems and diagnostic machinery. Rain streaked the windows in relentless sheets, blurring the city lights outside into watery smears. I barely registered it, my focus absolute, my world shrunk to the sterile gleam of my workstation. Evidence from the first two cases, the warehouse and the abandoned factory, lay meticulously arranged before me, side by side. High-resolution photographs, magnified scans of tool marks, residue analyses, and detailed topographical maps of the respective scenes. My chair creaked as I leaned closer, my breath fogging the clear plastic shield in front of me. I'd been here for hours, chasing a phantom, a whisper of a connection that nagged at the back of my mind since I'd linked the victims to the Institute of Applied Metrology and Precision Standards. It wasn't the obvious stuff, no matching fingerprints, no shared DNA, nothing that screamed serial killer to the uniformed officers. But I wasn't looking for obvious. I was looking for intent. I picked up the stylus, circling a minute detail on a photo from the warehouse scene. It was a fragment of broken ceramic, not much larger than my thumbnail, nestled beside the first victim's outstretched hand. I remembered noting its unusual placement at the time, almost too deliberate given the supposed struggle. Now I zoomed in on the corresponding report for the abandoned factory. There, near the second victim's foot, was a similar shard, this one glass, from a shattered fluorescent tube. Again, positioned with an unnatural, almost reverent care. My brow furrowed. Coincidence or something more? I switched between the images, my gaze tracing invisible lines. The ceramic piece in the warehouse, when viewed from the crime scene's primary vantage point, formed a perfect isosceles triangle with two other seemingly random debris points. The glass shard in the factory, from its own primary vantage, completed a similar, albeit inverted, geometric shape with two other objects. The angles, the ratios, they weren't identical, but the principle was. A subtle, almost imperceptible geometric signature woven into the chaotic tapestry of a violent death. This wasn't just neatness, it was precision, a type of spatial calibration. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the preliminary photos from the third crime scene, the dock. The full report wasn't in yet, but I scrolled through the initial shots. My eyes darted, searching. There it was, a discarded, rusted bolt lying at an odd, almost artful angle on the greasy concrete. I quickly triangulated its position against two other seemingly random pieces of refuse, a splintered wooden plank and a crushed soda can. My heart gave a lurch. Another perfect isosceles triangle. 3 victims, 3 distinct locations. 3 seemingly random pieces of debris, each forming a precise, almost ritualistic geometric pattern when viewed from a specific, carefully chosen perspective within the scene. It clicked. A cold, certain understanding settled in my chest. This wasn't chance. This was a signature, a deliberate, meticulous imprint left by someone obsessed with measurement, with order, with standards. It was the killer's way of saying, I was here, and I did this my way. The implications were enormous. It confirmed a serial killer, yes, but one whose modus operandi was so subtle, so intellectual, that it would be easily missed by anyone not looking for that specific kind of pattern. And it pointed directly back to the Institute of Applied Metrology and Precision Standards, not just as a connection for the victims, but as a potential source of the killer's specialized knowledge. I leaned back, a mix of triumph and unease swirling within me. I had found it, the ghost in the machine. But how was I going to explain this to the lead detective? He was a practical man, a believer in blood and bone, intangible evidence. A killer who left behind geometric theorems and debris. He'd likely scoff. I pushed away from the desk, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor, the sound sharp in the quiet lab. I grabbed my phone and dialed his direct line. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice gruff, tired. "Detective," I started, my voice betraying none of the excitement thrumming beneath my calm exterior. "I think I have something, a pattern. We've been over every file, no matching M. Oh, no consistent weapon, no common entry point. Unless I found matching DNA on a stray cat at all 3 scenes, I'm not sure what I rest seeing." I took a deep breath. "It's not that kind of pattern, sir. It's a signature of placement. Geometric. Each scene has a specific set of seemingly random objects, debris, arranged in a precise, almost ritualistic triangular formation when viewed from a particular vantage point within the scene." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear the skepticism forming on his face. "Geometric? Chen, are I telling me our killer is an artist or a mathematician?" His tone was laced with thinly veiled amusement. "He's precise, detective. Obsessively so. It's not about the objects themselves, but their relative positions, their angles. It's a statement, a deliberate act of calibration within the chaos. It speaks to someone with a deep understanding of metrology, of spatial relationships. Someone who has been trained to see the world in terms of precise measurements and standards, just like our victims. So, Iris saying the killer is leaving behind a puzzle for us, using broken junk, and I want me to tell the brass that we're looking for a serial killer who's also a geometry professor. His voice hardened, losing its earlier trace of humor. Chen, we need something concrete. DNA, fingerprints, a weapon, a witness. Something that will hold up. A pattern of neatness. That's not going to get us a warrant, much less a conviction. A wave of frustration washed over me. He wasn't seeing it. He was looking for the obvious, the conventional. My evidence was too subtle, too intellectual. Detective, it is concrete. It's a deliberate act. It's a message. This isn't just random debris. It's a meticulously staged element, a signature that screams precision and control. It connects the victims not just by their shared background, but by the killer's application of that background. I hear Chen, I do, he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. But it's a stretch, a big one. Keep digging for something more tangible, something we can present. This geometry lesson, it's not going to cut it right now. The line went dead. There was the isolation of the lab making me see patterns where there were none. For a fleeting second, doubt gnawed at me. But then I looked back at the screens, at the overlaid images, at the undeniable consistency of the angles, the almost imperceptible symmetry. No, I wasn't wrong. This wasn't a hallucination. It was real. They might not see it yet, but I did. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, a steady beat accompanying the storm brewing inside me. I was on the right track, and I would prove it even if I had to redraw the entire map myself. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, a prickle of annoyance mixing with a cold knot of dread. But then I looked back at the screens, at the overlaid images, the microscopic comparisons, and the doubt, a cowardly thing, retreated. The evidence was there, whispering, if only I could make sense of its fractured dialect. The rain hammered against the windows of the forensic pathology lab, each drop a tiny percussion on the glass, mirroring the relentless thrum of the city outside, or perhaps more accurately, the drumming of the media. A muted television in the corner, usually ignored, flickered with the face of a news anchor, her voice a low murmur I could almost filter out. Almost. Every now and then. A phrase cut through the hum of the lab equipment. Unprecedented brutality. Lack of progress. Public demands answers. My name hadn't been mentioned yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the spotlight swung fully onto the forensic team, onto me. A shadow fell across my workstation. I didn't need to look up to know it was the chief investigator, his presence usually preceded by the scent of stale coffee and an air of beleaguered authority. Chen, he answered, his voice clipped. Any movement on the latest victim? The press conference is in an hour. They're looking for something. I adjusted my glasses, my gaze still fixed on the magnified image of a fiber. I'm still correlating trace evidence, sir. This isn't a simple smash and grab. The killer is meticulous, almost clinically precise in what they leave behind and what they take. He sighed, a sound heavy with impatience. Meticulous is fine, Chen, but we need a name, a motive, something tangible for the public. The mayor's office is breathing down my neck. They want a profile, something actionable, not more microscopic comparisons. The microscopic comparisons are actionable, I countered, perhaps a little too sharply. It's how we find the cracks in their perfect facade. My eyes flickered to the fiber. It was a synthetic blend, unusual, and had appeared in 3 of the crime scenes, not a common fabric at all. Just keep me updated, he responded, the implied threat hanging in the air. We can't afford any more dead ends. The public confidence is eroding, Chen. He didn't get it. None of them did. They saw statistics, timelines, political pressure. I saw the victims, yes, but also the killer's fingerprints, not on a surface, but in the deliberate absence of them, in the carefully placed misdirections, in the almost imperceptible flaws. And the more I stared, the more personal it felt. This killer wasn't just taunting the police, they were taunting forensics. They were daring us to find them in the details, challenging the very tools I dedicated my life to. It was a direct affront to my craft, and a knot tightened in my gut. I had to find them. I pushed aside the current victim's file for a moment, letting my eyes drift back to the digital archives I'd pulled up earlier. Old cases. The ones that had always bothered me, where the evidence never quite aligned with the conclusion. The killer's pattern, I was increasingly convinced, wasn't new. It was evolving. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up a case from 7 years ago. A warehouse fire ruled accidental, but something about the burn patterns had always felt too neat. The victim, an unknown male, had been incinerated beyond recognition. The investigation had hit a wall when a suspect, a minor figure with known ties to the warehouse owner, presented an ironclad alibi. He'd been out of the country on a deep-sea fishing trip with multiple witnesses and satellite phone logs to prove it. Perfect. Too perfect. I scrolled through the forensic reports from that old case, my mind working through the details, cross-referencing against the current series. Burn patterns, accelerants, trace elements. Nothing obvious. But then I zoomed in on a footnote buried deep in the original fire investigation report. A single, almost negligible detail. Microscopic traces of a specific type of pollen. Artemisia annua, also known as sweet wormwood, found on the victim's few remaining personal effects: a belt buckle, a watch casing. At the time, the original analyst had dismissed it as environmental contamination. The warehouse was near a patch of undeveloped land, and Artemisia annua was common in the region. But something snagged in my mind. Sweet wormwood wasn't just a common plant. It was also cultivated for certain herbal remedies, and more importantly, for a specific, distinct aromatic oil. My heart gave a sudden, hard thump against my ribs. I pulled up the reports from the current series of murders. I'd been so focused on fibers, on skin cells, on obvious accelerants. But then I remembered a passing comment from the preliminary toxicology report on the second victim: a faint, almost imperceptible trace of Artemisia annua oil in the victim's bloodstream, initially attributed to a herbal tea they might have consumed. The report had noted its presence as an anomaly, but not significant enough to warrant further investigation given the more pressing causes of death. Now it screamed at me. Artemisia annua, oil in a current victim, dismissed as incidental. The plant itself was common, yes, but the oil was less so, and the pollen on personal effects from a closed warehouse fire was a specific physical transfer. I pulled up the alibi details for the warehouse suspect again. Deep-sea fishing. Where exactly? The logs showed a vessel operating hundreds of miles offshore, far from any land-based Artemisia annua patches, and the fishing trip lasted for weeks. Could he have been exposed to the pollen before the trip, and it simply lingered? Possible. But the sheer coincidence of that specific pollen, and now the oil across such a vast timeline, felt less like an accident and more like a signature. But the Artemisia annua pollen? It was a subtle discrepancy, a tiny seed of doubt planted in the seemingly impenetrable concrete of his alibi. It didn't break the alibi, not yet, but it suggested a connection, a touch point, a presence where there should have been none. My breath hitched. What if the killer wasn't just evolving their methods, but perfecting them? What if the perfect alibi from 7 years ago had a tiny, overlooked flaw, and now they were even more careful? This wasn't just about finding the current killer. It was about revisiting a past that had been prematurely buried. The stakes had just escalated, not just for the victims, but for the integrity of every closed case that had ever crossed my path. My isolation in this lab suddenly felt less like a burden and more like a necessity. I was the only one looking this deep. Just keep me updated on anything anomalous, anything at all. My voice had been firm, perhaps a little too much so for the late hour. The detective on the other end of the line had grunted an affirmation, and I'd hung up, leaving the silence of the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, to press in around me. The hum of the ventilation system was a constant companion, a low thrum beneath the rhythmic patter outside. I was alone, which was how I preferred it when I was chasing ghosts in the minutiae. My eyes, tired but resolute, were fixed on the synthetic fiber. It sat on a fresh slide, a tiny, almost invisible thread under the microscope's powerful lens. This was the same unusual blend, the same peculiar sheen that had surfaced in 3 different crime scenes. It was my current obsession, my personal Gordian knot. The killer was meticulous, almost arrogantly so. Every scene was a masterpiece of misdirection, a perfectly constructed narrative designed to lead investigators down blind alleys. But perfection, I'd learned, was an illusion. Even the most cunning mind left a fingerprint, not necessarily on a surface, but in the very fabric of their actions. I believed the killer was trying to create an imperfect loop, a staged scenario that seemed flawless, but contained a subtle, almost imperceptible flaw that would, ironically, loop back to their true identity or method. My job was to find that crack. I leaned closer to the eyepiece, adjusting the focus. The fiber, magnified thousands of times, filled my vision. It looked like a miniature, alien landscape, twisted polymers, tiny imperfections in the weave, dust motes clinging to its surface like microscopic barnacles. I'd spent hours on this, comparing samples from each scene, confirming they were identical. The material itself wasn't common, which was already a lead, but it didn't tell me who or why. I needed more. I needed the how. My fingers danced across the microscope's controls, moving the stage, scanning inch by microscopic inch along the fiber's length. I was looking for anything out of place. A fleck of paint, a speck of unusual pollen, a unique organic residue. Something the killer, in their pursuit of a flawless narrative, might have overlooked. The rain outside intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass. My coffee, long since cold, sat forgotten beside my elbow. My focus narrowed, excluding everything but the world under the lens. I felt the familiar tension in my shoulders, the slight ache behind my eyes, but also a surge of adrenaline. Then I saw it. A section of the fiber, no more than a few microns long, caught my attention. It wasn't a contaminant, not a foreign particle clinging to the surface. It was an alteration to the fiber itself. A distinct, almost geometric pattern of microscopic abrasion, unlike anything I'd observed before. It wasn't the random fraying of general wear, nor the clean cut of a blade. This was specific. My breath hitched. I zoomed in further, pushing the limits of the instrument. The pattern resolved into a series of minute parallel striations, incredibly fine, almost like tiny ridges carved into the synthetic material. They were perfectly uniform in depth and spacing, running perpendicular to the fiber's length. And then at the very edge of this patterned abrasion, I noticed something else, a faint, almost shimmering residue embedded deep within the grooves. It was iridescent, catching the light in a way that suggested metallic properties. Wait, I murmured, my voice hoarse in the quiet lab. That doesn't add up. The killer was so precise with their staging, so careful to eliminate any trace that wasn't part of their fabricated story. Why would a fiber, presumably shed by them or their equipment, bear such a unique and distinct mark? It implied a specific interaction, a process. I pulled back from the eyepiece, rubbing my temples. They was eye projecting. There was my desperate need for a lead making me see patterns where there were none. The fatigue was real. I took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, then leaned back in. No, it was there, unmistakable. I spent the next hour cross-referencing, comparing this section to hundreds of other fiber samples in our database and even to common industrial wear patterns. Nothing matched. This wasn't typical friction nor chemical degradation. The precision of the striations, combined with the embedded iridescent residue, pointed to something highly specialized. The residue, under even higher magnification and spectral analysis, revealed traces of a unique alloy, a specific blend of titanium and nickel, not commonly found in everyday items. This wasn't just a fiber from an unusual garment. This fiber had interacted with a very particular piece of equipment, or passed through a very specific kind of process. The striations suggested high-frequency contact, perhaps a vibrating component, or a rapid, controlled cutting or shaping process. My mind raced. This wasn't just a fiber, a signature of a tool, a machine, an environment. It meant the killer, or someone they had direct access to, worked with specialized machinery capable of producing such a precise, microscopic alteration. It wasn't just a random piece of clothing or upholstery. This fiber had been processed. The implication hit me with the force of a physical blow. The killer wasn't just meticulous in staging the scenes. They were meticulous in preparing their tools, their materials. But they'd overlooked this one tiny, almost invisible detail. A perfect loop, but with a single, crucial knot. This was it. The first actionable lead that didn't revolve around a red herring. It pointed away from general theories and towards a very specific skill set, a very specific industry. It wouldn't tell me who, not yet, but it would tell me what kind of person I was looking for. Someone with access to specialized manufacturing or processing equipment. Someone who handled this unique titanium-nickel alloy, someone who had unknowingly transferred a fiber with its unique wound onto a victim. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, blurring the cityscape outside. But for the first time in weeks, the fog in my mind began to clear. I had a direction, and the hunt, I knew, had just become far more dangerous. Because now I was no longer just looking for a killer, I was looking for a ghost in the machine. The rain hammered against the windows of the forensic pathology lab, distorting the city lights into shimmering blurs. Each drop seemed to echo the frantic rhythm of my thoughts. That fiber, it wasn't just unique, it was impossible. My initial excitement had been a jolt of pure adrenaline. After weeks of sifting through the killer's meticulously crafted crime scenes, finding something so distinctly theirs felt like a small victory, a chink in their armor. The fiber, a synthetic strand no thicker than a human hair, bore a series of microscopic parallel grooves, almost like tiny tire tracks. It was a pattern I'd never encountered in any forensic database, a signature etched into its very structure. My mind raced, connecting the dots. This wasn't a common textile fiber. Its rigidity, its almost metallic sheen under specific lighting, suggested something industrial, perhaps a composite material. The grooves weren't random, they were uniform, precise, as if the fiber had been drawn through a specialized machine, a die. It pointed to a manufacturing process, a very specific one. I leaned back into the microscope, adjusting the focus again. There it was, clear as day. The grooves were not just parallel. They had a subtle, almost imperceptible twist to them, a helix. This wasn't just any drawing process. It was extrusion, but with a rotational element designed to create strength or a specific texture. I'd seen similar patterns in highly specialized polymer filaments used in cutting-edge aerospace composites or in certain types of medical device manufacturing. My breath hitched. Medical devices. The killer's precision, their understanding of human anatomy, the way they manipulated blood flow at the scene, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just a fiber from their clothes or a piece of equipment they might have used. This was a component or a byproduct from a highly specialized field. It meant the killer had access to or worked within an industry that dealt with such materials. It was a world away from the common fabric fibers and dust I usually found. This was big. This was a lead that could narrow the suspect pool from millions to mere hundreds, perhaps even dozens. But then the euphoria began to curdle. A cold, creeping doubt slithered into my mind. This killer was a ghost, a phantom of precision. Every other piece of evidence had been a carefully placed lie, a red herring designed to mislead. Why this? Why leave something so uniquely traceable? It felt almost too easy, too perfect. I stared at the slide, the microscopic landscape of the fiber now looking less like a victory and more like a trap. Had I missed something? There was this another elaborate misdirection. No, the grooves were real, the helical pattern undeniable. It was a genuine physical trace. But what if it wasn't a mistake? What if it was deliberate? A breadcrumb leading me down a path chosen by them? A shiver ran down my spine despite the warmth of the lab. The rain outside seemed to intensify, drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass. I pushed the microscope aside and stood up, pacing the narrow space between my workbench and the towering evidence lockers. My eyes scanned the room, the familiar array of instruments suddenly seeming less like tools and more like potential vulnerabilities. I walked over to the secure locker where the victim's clothing, from which the fiber had been recovered, was stored. The heavy steel door was sealed, the padlock gleaming. I ran my hand over the cool metal, a faint unease settling in my gut. I double-checked the logbook. Everything was accounted for, signed in and out by the proper personnel. Returning to my bench, I decided to re-verify the chain of custody for the specific fiber sample itself. It was standard procedure, but today it felt urgent, almost frantic. I pulled up the digital records, scrolling through timestamps and signatures. Everything looked correct. The collection technician, the initial processing analyst, the transfer to my workstation, all documented. As I was about to close the file, something caught my eye, a tiny anomaly. A timestamp for the transfer of the primary evidence bag from the main evidence storage to my specific lab section. It was logged at 3:17 a.m. 2 nights ago. That was odd. I hadn't requested the bag until 8:00 a.m. that morning, and transfers usually happen during business hours, unless explicitly requested for an urgent overnight analysis. I certainly hadn't made such a request. My blood ran cold. I immediately checked the security logs for the lab section. Access was restricted, keycard entry only, and my section was particularly secure, requiring dual authentication after hours. I scrolled through the digital entries for that night. My own keycard showed entry at 7:45 a.m. The technician who brought the bag in was logged at 8:02 a.m. But there, sandwiched between a cleaning crew's departure at 2:00 a.m. and my own arrival, was an entry. An authorized access, but not by me and not by the standard evidence handler. It was a keycard belonging to a former colleague. My mind reeled. A former colleague. One who had been dismissed months ago for questionable ethics, for cutting corners, for a general disregard for protocol. He hadn't worked here in almost a year. How could his keycard still be active? And why would he be here at 3:17 a.m. accessing evidence from my case? This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a deliberate plant by the killer as a red herring. This was a deliberate compromise of my work, inside my lab. The killer wasn't just watching me, they were manipulating the very ground I stood on. They had an accomplice, or they were someone with deep institutional knowledge. There was this specific fiber, the one with the unique helical grooves, the one I had just found, even the original fiber from the crime scene, or had it been swapped? My hands began to tremble. Had I been so eager for a breakthrough that I'd walked right into their trap? The rain outside hammered harder, a furious drumbeat against the glass. I was no longer the hunter. I was the hunted, and the game had just turned deadly personal. I had to alert the detective, but how could I explain this without sounding paranoid, without implicating myself in a security breach I hadn't even known about? My reputation, my career, even my safety hung in the balance. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I needed to act and fast. But who could I trust? That fiber. My initial examination had suggested a synthetic polymer, something almost alien in its composition, yet familiar in its weave. But the more I stared, the more a chilling pattern began to emerge, not in the fiber itself, but in its very presence. I pushed away from the microscope, the hum of the ventilation system a low thrum against the drumming rain. My coffee, long cold, sat untouched. For weeks, I'd been chasing ghosts, meticulously dissecting every manipulated crime scene, every expertly placed red herring. The killer was good, frighteningly so, leaving behind a trail of evidence that was both abundant and utterly useless unless I knew how to look beyond the obvious. I walked over to the large whiteboard dominating one wall, covered in hastily scrawled notes, diagrams, and crime scene photos. Each victim, each location, each meticulously staged detail. The first victim, the elderly archivist, found in his study, a staged suicide note nearby, his digital footprint wiped clean. The second, a quiet librarian drowned in her bathtub, an antique locket missing, only to be found days later by a search team at a local park, seemingly dropped by accident. The third, a reclusive art restorer, a seemingly accidental fall from a scaffold, the safety harness subtly tampered with. Meticulous, I muttered to myself, tracing a finger along the timeline. Obsessed with control. The detective, a man whose patience was as thin as his mustache, had leaned heavily on the initial findings, the easy answers. He saw a series of unrelated incidents, each designed to look like something else entirely. But I saw the thread, the invisible string connecting them all, the precision of the misdirection. It wasn't just about making a murder look like an accident. It was about making it look like an accident that a forensic analyst would spend weeks trying to disprove. I grabbed a fresh marker and began to list the killer's traits, or at least what I perceived them to be. Intelligent, highly organized, evident in the planning and execution, patient, methodical, no rush, no sloppy mistakes, controlling, perfectionist, every detail accounted for, every piece of evidence manipulated, arrogant, leaving subtle hints almost daring us to find them. And then there was the fiber. I picked up the sealed evidence bag containing the minuscule strand. It was from the third scene, snagged on a loose nail near the tampered harness. My initial thought was a rare industrial material, a lead that would send us down a rabbit hole of specialized manufacturers. But the impossible part was its purity. Too perfect. Too clean. It didn't match any known database, yet it bore hallmarks of several different synthetic composites. What if it wasn't meant to be found as a lead? What if it was meant to be found as a distraction? My mind raced back to the archivist's study. The staged suicide note had been written on paper too old for the pen used, a subtle anachronism that screamed fake to anyone with a keen eye for historical detail. The librarian's locket, found in the park, had traces of soil that didn't quite match the park's specific geological profile, a detail only a specialized soil analyst would ever pick up. And the art restorer's harness. The cut was precise, almost surgical, designed to fray just enough under tension to appear like wear and tear, not deliberate sabotage. It wasn't just staging, it was counterforensics. I'd been so proud of finding these discrepancies, of seeing through the killer's initial layers of deception. I'd seen them as signs of the killer's arrogance, their inability to perfectly replicate reality. But what if that wasn't arrogance? What if it was a deliberate challenge? I walked back to the whiteboard, my heart beginning to thump a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I added another point to my list, scrawling it with an almost violent stroke. Possesses advanced forensic knowledge. The rain outside intensified, a violent torrent against the glass, mirroring the storm brewing inside me. This wasn't just a clever killer. This was someone who understood the intricacies of forensic investigation. Someone who knew what I, Chen, would be looking for. They weren't just covering their tracks, they were setting a trap for me. The fiber. It wasn't impossible because it was unknown. It was impossible because it was designed to be unknown, a perfect blend of elements meant to confound, to send me on a wild goose chase. It was a phantom lead, meticulously crafted to waste my time, to make me doubt the very foundations of my analysis. Had I been so focused on finding the impossible, on proving my unique insight, that I missed the obvious, terrifying truth? The killer wasn't just good at crime, they were good at my job. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the marker again. Mirrors my expertise, anticipates my methods. It wasn't just a game of cat and mouse, it was a reflection, Every trick I'd seen, every piece of manipulated evidence, every subtle misdirection wasn't just a random act of cunning. It was a precise, calculated countermove against the exact forensic protocols I would employ. The killer knew forensic science, not just academically, but practically. They knew the limitations, the blind spots, the exact points of vulnerability in our investigative process. They were using our own tools against us. My mind reeled. Who could possess such specific, intimate knowledge? It wasn't just a hobbyist's understanding. It was deeply ingrained, professional-level expertise, someone who had worked in the field, perhaps even alongside us. Or worse, someone who had studied us. It wasn't just a killer I was hunting. They were not just playing the game, they were writing the rules, tailored specifically to dismantle my every move. And that, I realized with a jolt, was why the fiber was impossible. It was a signature, not of identity, but of intent. A deliberate, personalized taunt designed to show me that they were always one step ahead. They weren't just trying to escape detection, they were trying to defeat me. I was in the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows. The rhythmic drumming against the glass was a relentless counterpoint to the storm raging inside my head. The faces of the victims, the meticulously placed evidence, the calculated misdirections, they all swirled together. A macabre ballet choreographed by a mind as sharp as it was twisted. The detective had left an hour ago, muttering about going through the motions with some minor leads. He didn't understand the depth of this. He saw a killer, yes, but not the architect. I saw a challenge, a taunt, someone who understood me. I pushed away the last case file, the faint scent of antiseptic and decay clinging to the pages. My eyes drifted to the notice board, cluttered with diagrams of blood spatter patterns, fiber analysis results, and the haunting, blurred photos of the crime scenes. Each one a masterpiece of deception. This wasn't just a clever killer I'd thought before. This was someone who understood the intricacies of forensic investigation, someone who knew what I, Chen, would be looking for. That last thought echoed, knew what I would be looking for. That was the key. Not just what I could find, but what I would prioritize, what my methodology demanded. This killer was playing chess, and I'd been reacting. It was time to make my own move. My gaze snagged on a microscopic image tacked near the corner, a single iridescent thread, labeled Unidentified Contaminant, Case 003. A chromatic polymer strand, barely visible to the naked eye, its vibrant blue shimmer almost alien against the drab backdrop of the victim's jacket fibers. We dismissed it weeks ago, an anomaly, a rogue thread from a lab coat, perhaps, or an environmental stray. But something about its perfect, almost deliberate isolation at the scene had always pricked at me. Now it screamed. The killer wasn't just leaving false trails, they were leaving challenges. Tiny, almost imperceptible signatures that only another forensic mind would truly appreciate, and this strand. This was a masterpiece of misdirection, a thread so unique it had to be deliberate, yet so out of place it had to be dismissed, a perfect forensic paradox. I leaned closer to the image, tracing the microscopic weave with my finger. What if the killer wanted me to find this, but then to dismiss it? What if they were waiting for me to make a mistake, to misinterpret their genius? My blood ran cold. No, not cold. A calculated heat, a surge of defiant energy. This was it. If they understood what I would look for, then I would show them exactly what I wasn't looking for, or at least what I was deliberately misinterpreting. The killer's meticulousness was their strength, their signature, their pride. And pride, I knew, was a fragile thing. I spent the next few hours buried in obscure material science journals, cross-referencing polymer structures, industrial applications, and rare manufacturing processes. I wasn't looking for the truth. I was constructing a plausible lie. Finally, I found it. A rare, discontinued synthetic fiber, once used in a very specific type of outdoor gear, manufactured by a defunct company decades ago. It was obscure enough to be convincing, yet utterly, completely irrelevant to the actual case. The beauty of it was in its benign nature. If I linked the chromatic polymer strand to this innocuous, forgotten fiber, it would effectively neutralize any unique forensic value it might possess. The faces of the victims, the meticulously placed evidence, the calculated misdirections, they all swirled together, a macabre ballet of confusion that had until now eluded a clear interpretation. My eyes burned, but the exhaustion was a dull ache beneath a sharp, desperate clarity. I had to be right. I couldn't afford to be wrong, not this time. A colleague's knuckles rapped softly on the open doorframe, pulling me from the abyss of my thoughts. Chen, the lead detective is ready, and the analyst is already in there. My stomach tightened. The analyst. The very person whose expert opinions had for weeks subtly steered the investigation away from the truth, whose seemingly helpful insights had only deepened the labyrinth. I took a deep breath, the sterile scent of the lab filling my lungs, a strange comfort. It was time. I walked down the short corridor to the small, windowless conference room, a space usually reserved for case briefings and coffee-fueled debates. Inside, the lead detective sat at the head of the polished table, his expression grim. Beside him, a senior investigator leaned back, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on me as I entered, and across from them, impeccably dressed, sat the analyst. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on their lips, a mask of calm confidence that suddenly felt like a challenge. "Chen," the lead detective began, his voice flat. "You added you had something definitive." I nodded, pulling out a slim folder and a small, sealed evidence bag. My hands, despite the tremor of anticipation, moved with practiced precision. "I do." I didn't look at the analyst directly, not yet. I focused on the monitor at the end of the table, preparing to project my findings. We've all been impressed by the sheer artistry of these crimes. I began, my voice steady, betraying none of the internal turmoil. The precision in the staging, the deliberate planting of misdirection, the way each scene told a perfectly crafted, misleading story. It was brilliant, truly, almost too brilliant. The senior investigator shifted. The analyst remained impassive, their gaze fixed on me, that ghost of a smile still playing. "That was the first thing that bothered me," I continued, clicking the remote, bringing up magnified images of various crime scene elements. The perfection, the blood spatter patterns, for instance. They were textbook examples of specific injury types, so precise, so clinical, like they were created to be read a certain way rather than resulting organically from chaos. I zoomed in on a particular spatter pattern from the first victim. Look at the uniformity here, the consistent droplet size, the angles of impact. We initially attributed this to a specific weapon, a specific force. But the more I looked, the more I saw a pattern within the pattern, a signature. I switched to another image, this time of trace fibers found at a scene, fibers we had initially dismissed as environmental contaminants or perhaps linked to a false lead. And these fibers, so perfectly placed, designed to suggest a struggle or a specific type of clothing. But again, the placement was almost too deliberate, not scattered but arranged like props on a stage. The analyst finally spoke, their voice smooth, almost patronizing. "Chen, with all due respect, you're describing the work of a highly intelligent, meticulous killer. We've known that since the first scene. You're simply reiterating what we've already established." I met their gaze, a cold spark in my own eyes. "No, I'm describing the work of someone who understands forensic science so intimately they could weaponize it. Someone who knew exactly what we'd look for, exactly how to give us what we wanted to find, to lead us down a predefined path." I clicked again. The screen displayed a comparative analysis of microscopic striations found within the blood spatter droplets. For weeks, I kept coming back to the spatter, not just its pattern, but its very composition. We identified it as human blood, of course, but the microfractures within the dried droplets, the way the edges curled and dried. The lead detective leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "These microfractures," I explained, pointing to specific areas on the screen, were not consistent with typical impact spatter from a blunt force or a sharp object. They showed a repetitive, almost machined signature. Like each droplet, or at least a significant portion of them, had passed through a very specific, irregularly shaped aperture. The analyst's composure wavered, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something recognition crossed their face. "We hypothesized a custom-made device," I continued, my voice gaining momentum. "Something designed to replicate specific spatter patterns with unnerving accuracy. A high-precision sprayer, perhaps, fitted with a bespoke nozzle. We searched for residues, for tool marks, anything. And for a long time, we found nothing. The killer was too good. They used disposable parts, left no obvious traces." I picked up the sealed evidence bag. Inside, nestled in cotton, was a tiny, almost invisible fragment. But they overlooked one thing. The very act of creating something with such extreme precision leaves its own fingerprint, even on disposable components. The killer, in their meticulous efforts to create perfect blood spatter, used a custom-fabricated nozzle. And that nozzle, being 3D printed with a very specific, high-end, industrial-grade machine, had an inherent microscopic imperfection. I brought up the final image, an electron micrograph of the fragment. It showed a repeating pattern of almost imperceptible micro-grooves, a signature of the 3D printer's extrusion process. This fragment, found embedded in a single, perfectly formed blood droplet from the final victim, matches the unique extrusion pattern of a specific, custom 3D printer, a printer known for its ability to create highly complex, precise components. I finally looked at the analyst, holding their gaze. A printer that, according to our records, I, the analyst, had exclusive access to for my advanced forensic tool development projects. I designed the nozzle to be untraceable, disposable. But I couldn't erase the signature of the machine that created it. A signature embedded within the very material of the nozzle, transferred microscopically to the spatter itself. The analyst's face drained of color. The ghost of a smile vanished, replaced by a raw, naked shock, then a simmering fury. "That's absurd," they spat, their voice losing its smooth veneer, cracking with desperation. "Circumstantial at best, a common defect easily misinterpreted." "Not this defect," I countered, my voice firm, triumphant. "This specific pattern is as unique as a fingerprint. It's the absolute proof we needed. It connects the fabrication of the murder weapon, the spatter-creating nozzle, directly to my machine and by extension to I. I didn't just analyze the evidence, I created it." The room was silent, save for the incessant drumming of rain against the lab windows. The lead detective slowly rose, his eyes fixed on the analyst. The senior investigator moved to stand behind the analyst's chair. The analyst stared at me, their eyes wide with a terrifying mix of defeat and hatred. The meticulous staging, the calculated misdirections, the abuse of forensic knowledge, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable conclusion. As two uniformed officers entered and moved towards the analyst, a profound weariness settled over me. The rain outside continued its relentless rhythm, but the storm inside my head had finally, thankfully, begun to subside. The rain still lashed against the forensic pathology lab windows, a relentless drumbeat against the sudden, stark silence that had fallen. The lead detective had moved swiftly, his voice low but firm, securing the analyst. My mind, a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts moments before, felt strangely calm now, a quiet eye in the storm. The senior investigator, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a grim resolve, had already begun making calls, his back to me. I watched the analyst being led away, their eyes still locked on mine, that terrifying mix of defeat and hatred burning even brighter in the dim lab light. It wasn't just the hatred of a cornered animal. It was the hatred of someone who felt profoundly wronged, someone whose carefully constructed world had just imploded. And I, Chen, had been the one to strike the match. The chair I sat in, cold and hard against my spine, felt like a monument to the countless hours I'd spent hunched over microscopes, poring over trace evidence, chasing ghosts in the data. My hands, still tingling from the adrenaline, lay flat on the cool metal of the examination table. The air was thick with the metallic tang of reagents and the faint, lingering scent of decay that always permeated this space, a scent I usually ignored but now registered acutely. I closed my eyes, letting the image of the analyst's face fade, replaced by a flood of details, a flood of the meticulously catalogued minutiae that had led us here. It had started with the fibers from the third victim, so carefully placed they screamed staging. Then the almost invisible residue on the second victim's clothing, a compound so obscure it pointed not to a random street drug, but to a specialized lab. The weight that doesn't add up moments had accumulated, each one a tiny brick in a wall of doubt I'd built around the initial, obvious conclusions. The killer hadn't just manipulated evidence, they had crafted it. Not to mislead entirely, but to create a narrative that was just plausible enough, just complicated enough, to send investigators down a series of dead ends. The genius and the horror of it was how they used the very tools of our trade against us. A speck of synthetic polymer, a microscopic dust particle, a specific degradation pattern in a tissue sample, all designed to point away from themselves, and often towards an innocent. My breath hitched. The analyst wasn't just a killer, they were a critic, a saboteur intent on exposing the perceived frailties of the system from within. They believed our science, our absolute reliance on physical evidence, was a house of cards, easily toppled by a skilled hand. Each staged murder was a calculated experiment, a demonstration of how easily truth could be twisted, how a narrative could be built from manipulated facts, how even the most rigorous protocols could be circumvented. I remember dismissing it as professional cynicism, the weariness of someone who had seen too much. But it was more than that. It was a deep-seated conviction, festering into a dangerous ideology. They wanted to prove that absolute truth. The kind we sought in the lab was an illusion. They wanted to show that even the most definitive evidence could be manufactured, that the meticulous details I cherished could be weaponized. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my head in my hands. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. It was precisely my unwavering faith in those meticulous details, my refusal to accept anything less than an unassailable truth that had undone them. The tiny, almost imperceptible flaws in their perfect staging, the one fiber that didn't quite fit the pattern, the subtle chemical signature that was too clean, the almost imperceptible deviation in a blood spatter analysis that hinted at a different point of origin than the one suggested. They had been brilliant, but not infallible, and I had been stubborn. There had been moments, countless moments, when I had doubted myself. There was I seeing patterns where none existed. There was I letting my own need for perfection blind me. That self-doubt had been a constant companion, a heavy cloak I'd worn through sleepless nights. But I pushed through, driven by an almost obsessive need to reconcile the discrepancies, to make the puzzle pieces fit without forcing them. And now, here we were, the analyst exposed. The truth, ugly and complex, laid bare. The rain outside intensified, a violent torrent against the glass. This lab, my sanctuary, my battleground, now felt tainted. The very foundation of what I believed in, the integrity of science, the unyielding nature of fact, had been challenged from within. This case would leave scars, not just on the victims' families, not just on the department, but on the very fabric of forensic science. It would force a reckoning, a re-evaluation of protocols, a renewed vigilance against internal corruption. I pushed myself up from the table, my legs stiff. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting an unforgiving glow on the empty space where the analyst had stood. The senior investigator had finished his calls and was now speaking quietly with the lead detective near the door. They glanced at me, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. My gaze drifted to the evidence bags still sitting on a nearby cart, waiting for final processing. Each one represented a life, a truth, a story that needed to be told accurately, without embellishment or manipulation. The echoes of this case, the absolute truth found in meticulous detail, would resonate for a long time. They would serve as a constant reminder that my work wasn't just about solving crimes. It was about safeguarding the truth itself. A truth that, as I now knew, could be a fragile and fiercely contested thing. My resolve hardened, a new, deeper determination settling within me. This wasn't just a job, it was a sacred trust. And I, Chen, was ready to uphold it.